Rose had perfected the art of moving through Copper Springs without being truly seen. Her uneven gait and the wooden crutch she relied upon marking her as someone to be pitied, ignored or occasionally mocked by cruel children whose parents never bothered to correct them. At 19, she had spent 7 years surviving as an orphan in a town that valued productivity and self-sufficiency above all else, and her twisted leg, a birth defect that had taken her mother's life during a difficult delivery, made her perpetually suspect in the eyes of those who believed physical perfection reflected moral worth. She earned her meager living through tasks that required patience rather than strength, mending torn clothing with stitches so small they were nearly invisible, sweeping the boardwalk outside the general store before dawn, washing dishes in the back of the town's single restaurant where customers would never have to see her. The restaurant owner, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Henley, tolerated Rose's presence because she worked for almost nothing and never complained about the scalding water or the endless parade of dirty plates. But tolerance was not kindness, and Rose understood the difference acutely. Mrs. Henley spoke to her in the clipped tones one might use with a slow child, never asking about her day or her thoughts, simply issuing instructions, and occasionally leaving a plate of food scraps that Rose was expected to eat gratefully in the alley behind the kitchen. Rose did eat gratefully, because hunger was a constant companion, and pride was a luxury she could not afford when survival required accepting whatever small mercies came her way. Her living situation was similarly precarious, a tiny room above the livery stable that the owner allowed her to occupy in exchange for mucking out stalls early each morning, before the regular stable hands arrived. The room was barely large enough for a narrow cot and a wooden crate that held her few possessions: 2 worn dresses, her mother's wedding ring that she kept hidden, a battered copy of poetry her father had read to her before fever took him when she was 12. The smell of horses and hay permeated everything, but Rose had long since stopped noticing it, just as she had stopped noticing many small indignities that made up her daily existence. She had learned that noticing too much, feeling too much, only made survival harder. The morning everything changed began like any other. Rose woke before dawn to the sounds of horses stirring below, dressed quickly in the cold darkness, and made her careful way down the ladder from her room using her crutch and the strength in her arms to compensate for her weak leg. She completed her stable work efficiently, then limped through the still dark streets toward the restaurant, where Mrs. Henley would already be preparing for the breakfast customers. The town was quiet at this hour, which Rose preferred. Fewer people meant fewer stares, fewer comments, fewer reminders of how completely she existed at the margins of community life. But this morning, unusual activity disturbed the typical pre-dawn stillness. A group of riders had arrived late the previous night, she learned from the stable owner's brief comment, bringing a prisoner they were holding in the town jail before transporting him to a military fort. Rose paid little attention initially. Prisoners passed through Copper Springs occasionally, usually men accused of theft or other frontier crimes, and their presence had nothing to do with her isolated existence. She continued to the restaurant and began her work, scrubbing pots from the previous evening and preparing dishes for the morning service. As the sun rose and the town began stirring to life, Rose heard increasing chatter from the restaurant's dining room about the prisoner. He was Apache, people said with a mixture of fear and fascination, a warrior captured after some skirmish and now being transported to face military justice. The customers spoke about him as if he were a dangerous animal rather than a human being, their voices carrying the casual certainty of people who had never questioned their assumptions about who deserved compassion and who deserved only chains. Rose listened while scrubbing dishes, her hands red and raw from the hot water, and felt an unexpected pang of something she could not quite name, perhaps recognition, perhaps sympathy for someone else whom society had decided to categorize as less than fully human. During a brief break in her work, Rose stepped into the alley behind the restaurant to rest her aching leg, which always hurt worse when she had to stand for long periods on the hard kitchen floor. From this position, she could see across the street to the small jailhouse where the prisoner was presumably being held. A crowd had gathered, mostly men, some boys hoping for excitement, all peering through the barred window and making comments Rose was too far away to hear clearly, but whose tone she recognized as mocking or hostile. She watched the crowd for a moment, then made a decision that surprised her even as she acted on it. Rose filled a tin cup with water from the restaurant's supply, then walked slowly across the dusty street toward the jailhouse, her uneven steps attracting attention from several of the gathered men. One of them, a rancher she recognized as particularly cruel in his treatment of anyone he considered weak or inferior, called out mockingly, asking if the crippled girl thought she could manage not to spill the water before she got there. Laughter rippled through the small crowd, and Rose felt the familiar heat of shame and anger rising in her chest, but she continued forward without responding, focusing on maintaining her balance and protecting the water in the cup. The sheriff, a tired-looking man named Cooper, who had always treated Rose with distant politeness if not actual kindness, stood near the jailhouse door. He looked surprised when Rose approached and quietly asked if she could give water to the prisoner. Cooper studied her for a moment, perhaps wondering at her motivation, then shrugged and stepped aside, apparently seeing no harm in allowing her small act of mercy. Rose entered the dim jailhouse, her eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness after the bright morning sunlight outside. In the single cell at the back of the small building, a man sat on the floor with his back against the stone wall, iron shackles binding his wrists and ankles. When he looked up at her approach, Rose saw in his eyes something that stopped her breath. Not the hostile savagery she had been conditioned to expect, but rather a profound weariness and resignation that mirrored her own constant state of being. The Apache warrior, Rose would later learn his name was Nietzsche, meaning mischievous one in a language she did not speak, watched her approach with cautious curiosity rather than the hostility or indifference she had half expected. She moved carefully toward the cell bars, mindful of her balance and the precious water she carried, then extended the cup through the bars toward him. For a long moment neither moved. Rose wondered if he would refuse, if pride or suspicion would prevent him from accepting water from the hands of someone connected to the people who had captured and chained him. But then Nietzsche shifted forward slowly, his movements restricted by the heavy shackles, and accepted the cup with both hands, drinking deeply while his eyes never left her face. When he finished and handed the cup back through the bars, he spoke a single word in English that his limited vocabulary apparently included, "Thank you." His voice was rough, perhaps from thirst or from simply not speaking for however long he had been held captive, but the gratitude in his tone was unmistakable. Rose nodded acknowledgement, finding herself unable to speak past the unexpected emotion rising in her throat. She had performed a simple act, giving water to someone thirsty. Yet the way he looked at her suggested it meant something more. Perhaps because kindness from his captor's people was rare enough to be remarkable. Before she could leave, Nietzsche gestured toward her crutch and then to his own shackled legs, making a connection between their restricted mobility that brought a sad smile to Rose's face. He seemed to be acknowledging their shared experience of physical limitation, of moving through the world differently than others expected or preferred. Rose appreciated the observation more than she could express in the moment, recognizing that he saw her in a way almost no one else in Copper Springs did, not as a pitiable cripple or an unfortunate burden, but simply as another human being dealing with circumstances beyond her control. Over the next several days, Rose found reasons to return to the jailhouse, bringing water and occasionally small portions of food she could spare from her own meager supplies. The townspeople's initial mockery faded into dismissive acceptance. If the crippled orphan wanted to waste her time on a savage prisoner, that was her business and simply confirmed her poor judgment. Sheriff Cooper continued allowing her visits, perhaps recognizing they caused no harm and possibly even appreciating that someone was ensuring the prisoner received basic care between the irregular meals the sheriff's wife provided. During these brief visits, Rose and Nietzsche began communicating through a combination of his limited English, her patient listening, and the universal language of gesture and expression. He taught her words in his Apache tongue, carefully pronouncing them and smiling when she attempted to repeat them with her clumsy accent. She taught him more English words in return, and gradually they built a vocabulary sufficient for simple exchanges about their experiences and observations. Rose learned that Nietzsche had been a scout and hunter for his people, that he had been captured during a peaceful trading mission by soldiers who made no distinction between hostile warriors and those simply trying to survive within increasingly restricted territories. More significantly, through their conversations, Rose began seeing herself through different eyes. When she apologized for being slow bringing water due to her leg, Nietzsche looked genuinely puzzled and asked why she would apologize for something that was not her fault or choice. When she referred to herself as a burden, he challenged the characterization, pointing out that she worked hard, contributed what she could, and showed kindness when most people showed only cruelty or indifference. His perspective was so completely foreign to what Rose had internalized over years of being treated as lesser that she initially dismissed it as mere politeness. But Nietzsche persisted in his alternative view, telling her stories about members of his own community who had physical differences or limitations, yet were valued for their wisdom, their skills in crafts, their roles in ceremonies and decision-making. These conversations planted seeds of doubt about assumptions Rose had carried for so long she had stopped recognizing them as assumptions rather than facts. What if her worth was not determined by her ability to walk without a crutch? What if the townspeople's dismissive treatment said more about their limitations than about hers? What if she had been measuring herself against standards that were themselves flawed and incomplete? The questions were uncomfortable, challenging foundations she had built her identity upon, yet Rose found herself unable to stop thinking about them during the long hours of work and the quiet evenings alone in her room above the stable. One afternoon, as Rose sat on the floor outside Nietzsche's cell, Sheriff Cooper had stopped objecting to her extended visits. Once he realized she caused no problems, the warrior asked her what she dreamed about for her future. The question caught Rose completely off guard. No one had ever asked her about her dreams or her future. The assumption had always been that someone like her had neither, that survival itself was the extent of what she could reasonably expect. She sat in silence for a long time, trying to formulate an answer, and eventually admitted that she had stopped dreaming years ago, that it hurt too much to want things that could never be. Nietzsche received this confession with sadness, but not acceptance. He told her that his people believed every person carried medicine, a unique gift or purpose, that was theirs alone to fulfill, and that discovering and honoring that medicine was the work of a lifetime regardless of what obstacles existed. He had no idea what her medicine might be, he said, but he was certain she possessed it, and that settling for mere survival was wasting the gift she had been given. His words were both inspiring and frustrating, easy enough to say when you came from a culture that apparently valued people differently. But how was she supposed to discover purpose and meaning when her daily reality consisted of washing dishes and mucking stables while trying not to starve? Yet despite her resistance, Nietzsche's perspective continued working on Rose's understanding like water, slowly shaping stone. She began noticing things she had stopped seeing. The quality of her needlework that made women return with additional mending requests. The fact that Mrs. Henley's kitchen ran more efficiently when Rose worked there. The way the stable owner's horses were calmer and cleaner when she attended them. These were small things, perhaps insignificant in the grand scheme of life, but they were real skills and real contributions. Maybe she was not as worthless as she had been taught to believe. Maybe there was difference between being unable to do everything and being unable to do anything meaningful. As the week passed and the date approached, when Nietzsche would be transported to the military fort, Rose felt growing dread about losing this unexpected friendship that had challenged and changed so much of her thinking. She had never experienced connection like this. Someone who saw past her physical limitation to recognize her as a complete person, who valued her presence enough to share his thoughts and experiences, who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being and her future. The impending loss made her realize how profoundly lonely she had been for years, mistaking isolation for independence and resignation for acceptance. On Nietzsche's last evening in Copper Springs, Rose brought him water as always, but this time she also brought a small gift, a carefully sewn pouch made from scraps of good leather she had saved, decorated with simple stitching in patterns she hoped might be appropriate, though she had no real knowledge of Apache designs. She offered it shyly, explaining that she wanted him to have something to remember their friendship. Nietzsche accepted the gift with visible emotion, examining the careful workmanship, and then meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. He told her in his careful English that she had given him something far more valuable than a pouch. She had shown him kindness when he had expected only hatred, had treated him as human when others treated him as animal, and had reminded him that goodness existed even in the darkest circumstances. He would carry her gift and her memory with him wherever he went, and he hoped she would carry his words with her as well, that she was worthy of far more than the life she had been accepting, and that someday she might find the courage to claim it. The morning after Nietzsche's departure, Rose woke with a strange hollowness in her chest, as if something essential had been removed and she had not yet adjusted to its absence. She went through her usual routines, the stable work, the walk to the restaurant, the endless dishes and cleaning, but everything felt different now, colored by the absence of those daily visits to the jailhouse. That had become the one part of her day she actually anticipated rather than merely endured. Mrs. Henley commented sourly that Rose seemed distracted and needed to pay better attention to her work. But Rose barely registered the criticism. Her mind kept returning to conversations with Nietzsche, to his insistence that she possessed value and purpose beyond what others recognized or she had learned to accept. Over the following weeks, Rose found herself increasingly unable to return to the numb acceptance that had characterized her existence before Nietzsche arrived. She began noticing more acutely the casual cruelties and dismissive treatment she received, the way Mrs. Henley spoke to her as if she were simple-minded, the way customers in the restaurant looked through her as if she were furniture rather than a person, the way children sometimes threw small stones at her when adults were not watching and laughed at her uneven attempts to dodge. Previously, she had absorbed these indignities as inevitable, the price of being different in a world that valued conformity and punished deviation. But Nietzsche's perspective had planted something in her mind that refused to accept such treatment as natural or deserved. The change was not immediate or dramatic. Rose did not suddenly confront her mistreatment or demand better conditions. Years of conditioning toward passivity and acceptance could not be undone by a few conversations, however meaningful. But small shifts began occurring in how she carried herself, how she responded to situations. When Mrs. Henley snapped at her for working too slowly, Rose calmly explained that she was being as efficient as her physical limitations allowed, and that if the pace was insufficient, Mrs. Henley was welcome to find a replacement. The statement was delivered without hostility, but also without the apologetic tone Rose usually employed, and Mrs. Henley's surprised expression suggested she had never been challenged, however mildly, by her crippled dishwasher. Rose also began spending more time on her needlework, which had always been a source of quiet pride, though she had never actively promoted her skills beyond accepting whatever jobs came to her. She started approaching some of the town's women directly, showing them examples of her finest stitching and offering her services for more complex mending and alterations at fair prices rather than the pittance she usually accepted. Several women agreed to try her work, perhaps out of curiosity about this new assertiveness from someone they had viewed as fundamentally passive. The resulting commissions were modest, but they represented something significant. Rose actively seeking opportunity rather than simply accepting whatever came her way. The additional income from needlework, though small, gave Rose something she had never possessed: options. She began saving carefully, hoarding coins in her hidden spot alongside her mother's ring, building toward a future she could not yet clearly envision, but which she now believed might exist beyond simple survival. She also started making small improvements to her living situation, purchasing fabric to make a curtain that gave her tiny room some privacy from the stable below, buying a better lamp that allowed her to work on sewing during evening hours, acquiring a thick blanket that made cold nights more bearable. Each purchase was tiny, almost insignificant, but collectively they represented Rose's beginning to invest in her own comfort and well-being rather than merely enduring whatever conditions existed. These changes did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Henley became increasingly irritable with Rose's new tendency to speak up when criticized unfairly, and their relationship grew more tense until finally, about 2 months after Nietzsche's departure, Mrs. Henley informed Rose that she would need to find other employment because her attitude had become problematic. The dismissal was delivered with self-righteous indignation, as if Rose had committed some grave offense rather than simply asserting basic dignity. Rose accepted the news with more calm than she would have believed possible months earlier. Losing the restaurant work meant losing regular income, which was genuinely frightening. But it also meant freedom from daily humiliation and from Mrs. Henley's casual cruelty. With her restaurant position gone, Rose focused more intensively on building her needlework business. She placed a small notice in the general store advertising her services, using careful language, emphasizing her skill and reliability. The response was better than she dared hope. Several women brought her projects, and when they collected the finished work and saw the quality, they spread word to others. Rose found herself with more commissions than she could easily complete, working long evening hours by lamplight to fulfill orders while also maintaining her stable duties and finding other odd jobs to ensure adequate income. The increased needlework income allowed Rose to make a decision. She had been considering with growing seriousness she could afford to rent a small room in the boarding house near the center of town, a space that would be significantly better than her current accommodation above the stable, and which would give her a more respectable address that might help her attract additional business. The boarding house owner, a widow named Mrs. Patterson who had always treated Rose with distant but not unkind neutrality, agreed to rent her a modest room at a rate Rose could just barely afford if she remained careful with her spending. Moving into the boarding house represented a significant shift in Rose's circumstances and her identity within Copper Springs. She was no longer the pitiful orphan living above a stable, doing whatever work no one else wanted. She was now a skilled craftswoman with her own room in a respectable establishment, someone who contributed value through her work, rather than existing on the margins of charity and tolerance. The change was not dramatic enough to completely transform how people viewed her. She still used a crutch, still walked with an uneven gait, still existed as visibly different in ways that made some people uncomfortable. But there was a subtle shift in how she was treated, a growing recognition that she possessed skills worth respecting, even if her physical difference remained. One evening, as Rose sat in the boarding house common room working on a complex alteration for one of the town's more prominent women, Mrs. Patterson brought her tea and sat down nearby, apparently wanting conversation. The widow commented that Rose seemed different lately, more confident and self-possessed, and she wondered what had changed. Rose considered the question carefully, then explained honestly about her friendship with the Apache prisoner and how his perspective had challenged assumptions she had carried about her own worth and possibilities. Mrs. Patterson listened thoughtfully, then observed that sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected teachers, and that growth often required someone from outside our normal world to show us what we could not see from within it. The conversation with Mrs. Patterson marked another subtle but significant shift. It was the first time in years that someone in Copper Springs had engaged Rose in genuine dialogue as an equal, asking about her thoughts and experiences, rather than simply issuing instructions or offering superficial pleasantries. Rose realized that she had changed in ways that extended beyond her external circumstances. She carried herself differently now, spoke with more confidence, met people's eyes rather than automatically looking down in habitual deference. Naichi had not just given her encouraging words. He had somehow given her permission to see herself as he had seen her, as someone complete and valuable, despite physical differences, as someone whose limitations did not define her entire existence or potential. As autumn arrived, and temperatures began cooling from summer's intense heat, Rose's needlework business had grown to the point where it provided her primary income, supplemented only by occasional odd jobs, rather than the constant scrambling for any available work that had characterized her previous existence. Women throughout Copper Springs, and even from neighboring properties, brought her their most challenging alterations and their finest garments needing repair, trusting her skill in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Rose took pride in the work, approaching each piece with the care and attention that had always been her nature, but which now felt validated and appreciated rather than taken for granted. The financial stability, modest though it remained, gave Rose something she had never experienced: the luxury of thinking beyond immediate survival to consider actual choices about her future. She began contemplating possibilities that previously would have seemed absurdly unrealistic. Perhaps she could eventually rent a small shop space and operate her needlework business more formally. Perhaps she could hire an assistant to help with simpler tasks while she focused on the complex work. Perhaps she could even expand into creating original garments rather than only altering existing ones. These dreams remained tentative and uncertain, but their very existence represented transformation from the resigned acceptance that had governed her thinking for so many years. One afternoon, a well-dressed woman Rose did not recognize arrived at the boarding house asking to speak with her about a significant commission. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Victoria Ashford, wife of a wealthy rancher whose property lay about 20 miles outside Copper Springs. Mrs. Ashford had heard about Rose's needlework skills from several satisfied customers, and she had a proposal that was larger in scope than anything Rose had yet undertaken, creating an entire wardrobe for Mrs. Ashford's daughter, who was preparing to travel east for finishing school. The commission would include multiple dresses, traveling costumes, and various accessories, all to be completed within 3 months. The payment offered was substantial enough to make Rose's breath catch, more money than she typically earned in 6 months of steady work. Rose's first instinct was to refuse, overwhelmed by the scope and intimidated by the high expectations such wealthy clients would bring. But then she heard Nietzsche's voice in memory, asking what she dreamed about for her future, challenging her to recognize her own capabilities and worth. She took a steadying breath and told Mrs. Ashford she would accept the commission, but she would need partial payment up front to purchase the necessary materials and supplies. Mrs. Ashford agreed immediately, apparently accustomed to such business arrangements, and they discussed details about styles, fabrics, and timeline. As the wealthy woman departed after providing a generous deposit, Rose stood holding more money than she had ever possessed at one time, feeling equal parts excitement and terror about what she had just committed herself to accomplishing. The next 3 months tested Rose's skills, endurance, and confidence in ways nothing had before. She worked long hours creating garments that had to meet exacting standards, while also maintaining her other commissions to ensure steady income beyond the Ashford project. Her hands ached constantly from the detailed work, and her weak leg throbbed from hours sitting in positions that put strain on already compromised joints. But she pushed through discomfort and doubt, driven by determination to prove, to herself as much as to Mrs. Ashford, that she could deliver quality work worthy of the trust and payment she had received. As Rose worked, she found herself thinking often about Nietzsche and wondering about his fate. Had he reached the military fort? Was he imprisoned there, or had he been moved elsewhere? Did he think occasionally about their brief friendship and the conversations that had meant so much to her? She had no way to know, no means of sending messages even if she knew where he was. Yet she felt his presence in the changes she had made and the courage she was finding to claim a life beyond mere survival. He had planted seeds during their conversations, and she was determined to nurture them into something real and lasting, something that would honor his faith in her capabilities. Even if he never knew how profoundly his words had affected her trajectory. When Rose finally completed the last piece of Mrs. Ashford's daughter's wardrobe and carefully packed everything for transport to the ranch, she felt both exhaustion and pride unlike anything she had previously experienced. She had created beautiful work, garments that showcased her skill and artistry, pieces that the young woman would wear with confidence in sophisticated Eastern social settings. When Mrs. Ashford arrived to collect the completed commission, her reaction exceeded Rose's hopeful expectations. The wealthy woman examined each piece carefully, exclaiming over the precise stitching, the elegant proportions, the thoughtful details that elevated the garments beyond simple functionality to genuine craftsmanship. Mrs. Ashford paid the remaining balance as agreed, then added a substantial bonus and asked if Rose would be interested in ongoing work for the family and their social circle. Rose accepted gratefully, recognizing this as the kind of opportunity that could genuinely transform her circumstances from modest stability to something approaching prosperity. As Mrs. Ashford departed, she made one additional comment that stayed with Rose. She said that when she first heard about the talented needleworker in Copper Springs, She had been surprised to learn it was the disabled orphan girl, because she had never imagined someone with such limitations could produce work of such quality. But seeing the results had taught her that she needed to examine her own assumptions about what people with physical differences were capable of achieving. The comment contained both compliment and insult. Mrs. Ashford was acknowledging Rose's skill while also revealing her prejudiced assumptions, but Rose chose to focus on the positive aspect. Her work had challenged someone's limiting beliefs, had demonstrated that physical difference did not determine capability or worth. Perhaps that was part of her purpose, part of the medicine Nietzsche had spoken about. Not just creating beautiful work, but doing so in ways that forced people to reconsider their assumptions about what someone like her could accomplish. Over the following months, Rose's business continued growing through referrals from satisfied clients like Mrs. Ashford. She began saving significant portions of her income, building toward goals that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. She purchased better tools and supplies, invested in a small collection of fashion plates and pattern books that allowed her to offer clients current styles, and even hired a young girl to help with simple tasks like cutting fabric and basic hemming. Rose still faced challenges. Her legs still hurt. She still encountered occasional cruel comments or dismissive treatment. She still had to work harder than most people to accomplish everyday tasks. But these difficulties no longer defined her entire existence or determined her sense of worth. One spring evening, almost exactly a year after Nietzsche's brief presence in Copper Springs, Rose sat in her boarding house room working on a particularly intricate embroidery project. She thought about the invisible girl she had been, the one who apologized for existing, who accepted cruelty as natural, who had stopped dreaming because dreams were too painful when they seemed impossibly out of reach. That girl still existed within her somewhere, scarred by years of being treated as lesser, but she was no longer the only version of Rose that existed. There was also this newer self, the capable craftswoman, the small business owner, the person who had learned to recognize her own value even when others failed to see it. 2 years after Nietzsche had changed her life during his brief imprisonment in Copper Springs, Rose received news that surprised her profoundly. Sheriff Cooper stopped by the boarding house one evening to speak with her, his manner suggesting he carried information of some significance. He explained that he had recently encountered a federal agent who was conducting research into various cases of Apache prisoners who had been transferred through frontier towns, and this agent had specifically asked about the warrior who had been held in Copper Springs 2 years prior. The agent had been tracking what happened to these prisoners and wanted to inform people who had shown them kindness about their eventual fates. Rose felt her heart begin pounding as Sheriff Cooper continued. Nietzsche had been held at the military fort for several months after leaving Copper Springs, but due to advocacy by several officials who recognized that his capture had been unjust, he had committed no crimes and had been engaged in legitimate trading when soldiers arrested him. He had eventually been released and allowed to return to his people on their reservation lands. More remarkably, Nietzsche had apparently spoken to the federal agent about the young woman in Copper Springs who had brought him water and kindness when everyone else showed only hostility, and he had asked the agent to convey his gratitude and his hope that she was well. The sheriff also carried a physical message, a small item Nietzsche had given the federal agent to deliver if Rose could be located. Sheriff Cooper handed her a carefully wrapped package, and when Rose opened it with trembling hands, she found a beautiful piece of traditional Apache craftwork, a small woven basket decorated with intricate geometric patterns in natural dyes. Tucked inside was a brief note, written in careful English that must have taken Nietzsche considerable effort to compose. The note read simply, "You gave me water and kindness. I hope you found your medicine. You are remembered with honor. Nietzsche." Rose held the basket and read the note multiple times, tears streaming down her face as she processed the unexpected gift and message. Nietzsche had survived his imprisonment, had returned to his people, and had remembered her enough to ensure a message reached her 2 years later. More than that, his note suggested he believed she might have found her purpose, that the seeds he planted during their brief friendship might have grown into something meaningful. She thought about everything that had changed since those conversations in the jailhouse, her growing business, Her increased confidence, her shift from mere survival to actually building a life with purpose and possibility. Perhaps she had found her medicine, or at least had begun the journey toward discovering it. In the weeks following this unexpected news, Rose found herself reflecting deeply on the full arc of her transformation. She had spent most of her life accepting other people's definitions of who she was and what she was capable of becoming. The townspeople had decided she was pitiable and limited, and she had internalized those judgments until they became her own self-understanding. It had taken someone from completely outside her world, someone her society had taught her to view as enemy and savage, to show her that those definitions were false, that her worth was not determined by her physical difference or by the prejudiced assessments of people who refused to see beyond surface appearances. The irony was not lost on Rose. The civilized townspeople who attended church and spoke about Christian charity had treated her with casual cruelty or dismissive indifference, while the savage prisoner had recognized her humanity and treated her with genuine respect. The contrast had forced her to question everything she had been taught about who possessed virtue and wisdom, about which cultures and peoples deserved respect versus dismissal. Perhaps goodness and cruelty distributed themselves across all groups, and making judgments based on categories rather than individual character was fundamentally flawed, a lesson that extended far beyond her personal situation to the larger conflicts and prejudices that shaped Frontier. Life. Rose decided to honor Daiche's memory and message by continuing to push beyond the limitations others tried to impose on her. She began working toward a goal she had been considering for months, opening her own shop rather than working from her boarding house room. She found a small storefront that was available for reasonable rent, and after careful calculation of her finances and her steady client base, she committed to the lease. Opening Rose's fine needlework felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, a public declaration that she was a legitimate businesswoman worthy of commercial space rather than someone who needed to hide her. Work in private rooms where customers would not have to see her difference. The shop's opening attracted both support and skepticism. Many of her regular clients were delighted to have a proper location where they could bring work and discuss projects in comfortable surroundings. Some townspeople expressed surprise that the disabled orphan had managed to establish an actual business, their comments revealing assumptions they had held about her limitations. A few customers initially stayed away, apparently uncomfortable with the idea of a disabled proprietor, but most eventually returned when they needed quality work and realized their prejudices were costing them access to the best needleworker in the region. Rose hired 2 assistants, young women who needed employment and who she could train in the skills that had become her livelihood. She found deep satisfaction in teaching others, in passing along knowledge and providing opportunities she had rarely received herself. One of her assistants was a quiet girl with a noticeable scar on her face who had faced her own struggles with social acceptance, and Rose made certain to emphasize that skill and character mattered far more than appearance, that physical differences did not determine worth or capability. She recognized herself in this young woman and hoped to provide the encouragement and validation she wished someone had offered her years earlier. As the shop became established and her reputation grew, Rose occasionally encountered traveling Apache traders who passed through Copper Springs selling crafts and goods. She always made a point of treating them with respect and fairness, offering water and hospitality regardless of how other townspeople reacted. Some of the traders seemed surprised by her kindness, perhaps unaccustomed to receiving courteous treatment from settlers. Rose never explained her motivations in detail, but she hoped that somehow through networks she did not understand, word might reach Naich that the woman he had befriended was honoring his memory through her actions and her refusal to accept the prejudices that had once governed both their lives. 3 years after opening her shop, Rose received another unexpected visitor, Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house, who had become a genuine friend over the years. The widow brought news that a group of Apache people were camped nearby, seeking permission to trade in town, and that one of them had specifically asked if anyone knew about a woman who walked with a crutch and did needlework. Rose's heart leaped at the possibility, though she tried to manage her expectations. It might be mere coincidence, or it might be someone who had simply heard stories rather than nature himself.